So here it is. This is the RG35XX Plus. And in this video, I'm going to be giving you a quick overview of what's new with the RG35XX Plus and the main differences between it and the original Anbernic RG35XX. So maybe you already have a 35XX and are considering upgrading but aren't really sure if it's worth it, or you haven't bought either of them yet and you're considering, should I spend the extra $20 or so on the 35XX Plus, or should I save a little bit of money and just buy the original RG35XX? So in this video, I'm going to do my best to show you guys the main differences, the things that I do like about the RG35XX Plus, and the things that I don't like. And I'm also going to quickly show you guys the new firmware, which has been updated since it originally came out. So if you watch a review at launch, there have been some updates in the last few days. Some minor things have changed and you can keep that in mind. And I'll have a link down below in the description for both of these handhelds. If you decide to buy them, I'd really appreciate it if you use my link. It costs you nothing extra and helps support a small channel like mine. Anyway, let's take a look. So I'm pretty sure the box is a little bit different than the RG35XX's, but no one really cares about the box too much. You take it out and you can see the handheld itself, as well as a few accessories. You get a screen protector, your wipes, a charger, and a manual. And now the most important part, the handheld itself. You can see I opted for the white version. There's also other colors that they have available, but I really love the white one and I think it looks super clean. Of course, it wouldn't look super clean if you're giving it to a kid or playing it outside or something, but for me, this was my favorite, and it wasn't available for the original RG35XX, so I decided to go for something a little bit different. And right off the bat, putting it against the original RG35XX, you can see that they're almost indistinguishable. To the untrained eye, they almost look like the same handheld. And that's because from the outside, they basically are. Anbernic clearly made an attempt to make them look as similar as possible. You can see they both have the same start and select buttons on the bottom, a function menu button, A, B, X, Y buttons. You can see on the new RG35XX Plus, they have the A, B, X, Y printed on the buttons themselves instead of under them. You have a D-pad, which is actually new here. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Turning it over to the back, you have these new curved shoulder buttons, which I really love. I thought they looked a little bit odd before I tried them, but they genuinely are super comfortable. They're so much more comfortable than the original RG35XX. It just feels a lot easier for your fingers to want to slide off of them because they're so flat, but not now. I just feel my index fingers comfortably resting on them, not even remembering anything about them, and that's a good thing because you don't want to have to constantly be worrying about your finger placement, etc., which can be tough with some of these smaller vertical handhelds, but I genuinely love this addition here, as well as a battery compartment that's super easy to access, and you can see it's just secured here with one screw, which I actually like better than the ones that you're just able to pull off without unscrewing anything, because I'm always afraid they're going to come off when I'm playing. It's never happened, it probably never will, but that's always a fear of mine. And on the right side, you have the same setup, 2 micro SD card slots, a power and a reset button, and on the other side, your volume keys, and the design is a little bit different. There's an indentation in the middle. They may actually be somewhat further into the handheld, but not really anything that's noticeable. I'm indifferent to it. I never really found anything wrong with the other volume buttons on the original RG35XX, but these are fine too, so I don't really care. You have a mini HDMI port up top, and then a USB-C and headphone jack on the bottom, so everything there is the same. So now turning it on, you can see the familiar stock Anbernic OS, and I'll make one note before I show you guys all the new features and things that are different from the original RG35XX. This is not the exact same firmware that they shipped with this. If you bought this when it first launched or shortly after, you will have gotten an older version of the OS that I'm using now. They made a small update, and unfortunately you can't get that over Wi-Fi, and this does have Wi-Fi on it. I'm going to talk about that in a second. You have to download a ridiculously large file online, flash it to a micro SD card, and put it in, and that's what I did. A little bit annoying, but if you want to get the absolute latest updates, you could do that. I would imagine the new units they're churning out will come with that updated version, so you're probably not going to have to worry about doing any of that if you want to keep the original micro SD card, which is usually not recommended, but I'm sure a lot of people do. So while I was just talking, you saw a little overview of the menu, so I'm not going to go too in depth with everything here because most of it actually was present on the original RG35XX, so if you own that and use the stock OS for a little bit, you probably recognize quite a bit of this. You can see right here we have the game room section, which just runs all of the emulators in the same way that it did on the RG35XX. RG35XX through their standalone emulators, and if you run games through here, which for most of the time I would not recommend, you won't have access to your RetroArch settings in game or any of that kind of stuff. So I'd recommend using the RA Games section, which has basically all of the same emulators. There might be a few that are different, and if you launch your games through here, you'll have access in game to all of your RetroArch settings, which certainly will give you a lot more customization. For example, if you want to increase the resolution in a game, you can do it through here, but not if you launch the game through Game Room. So I'd recommend doing that, and I'll have more on that in a second. Then you have favorites and search, and then finally you have your settings. So most of the settings are the same, except for now we have options for Wi-Fi. If you want to use retro achievements or something similar, you can use that. And then we have Bluetooth also, so if you want to connect a wireless controller, you also have that option, as well as Moonlight, which is pretty interesting. I'm not going to mess around with it in this video, but I'm sure it would be really interesting to try out. So we do have some new settings here in the Plus, but nothing too major. And the new firmware update does help some things along, like there was some weird awkward phrasing, for example, in the old settings and the stock OS that came shipped with it, and then the updated version fixed some of that. So I guess if that drives you crazy, your settings are a little bit better now. So getting into the emulation, before we really jump into the interesting stuff, N64, Dreamcast, DS, PSP emulation, I'm going to go over what seems to be pretty close to the original RG35XX. So when it comes to older emulation, SNES, Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color, stuff like that, everything that's lower end is going to run fine on both the Plus and the original. The only difference is if you want to stick with the stock firmware, you're not going to have access to a lot of RetroArch settings on the original that you will now on the Plus. But of course, that can be fixed by bringing custom firmware over to the original, like Garlic OS 1.0, I guess you call it, because the 2.0 is coming out and is going to be more finalized soon for the new RG35XX Plus, so stay tuned for that. But on the stock OS, you won't have access to these on the original, and on the Plus you do. But for the most part, for the lower end emulation, everything is going to be almost the exact same. But what is new is that the RG35XX Plus is much more powerful than the original RG35XX. Maybe saying much more is kind of an overstatement, but there are clear differences that shine through when you're trying to do higher end emulation. Now, on the original RG35XX, the highest you could go on the stock OS and that could perform well was PlayStation 1, and still is. You can get custom firmware for the original and play some games higher up that I'm going to show you here, but they don't play super well just because the hardware on the original isn't really suited for playing these higher end games. So I'm not going to show that off here. If you're really interested in trying to push your original RG35XX to the max, you can try it out. You can get Batocera, you can get new emulators for it, and maybe get some games working, but in all honesty, it's not the greatest. So here we have the new RG35XX Plus, and it's shipping with Dreamcast games, with PSP games, with Nintendo DS games, and it can run N64 games. It didn't come with any for whatever reason, but you can play them on here. So let's take a look at that right now. So I was really impressed with the Dreamcast performance, and in a lot of games I could even increase the resolution and still get really good performance. I wouldn't recommend increasing it for every game because it of course will drain your battery more, and some games won't run perfectly with it. And almost every Dreamcast game that I tried out, I was getting very good performance. I'm not going to say that this thing is a perfect Dreamcast machine because it's not completely there yet. If you wanted to play every single Dreamcast game without any flaw, I'd recommend paying a little bit more money for something else, but for the most part, this thing can run Dreamcast games very well, and even, like I said, increase the resolution a bit for some games. So I was really happy with Dreamcast on here. And then we have Nintendo DS emulation, and there was an improvement that you got with a new firmware update that was not there on the original firmware. Now you're able to move the stylus around, which I guess you were not able to do originally, so that's going to be something important for DS games. Obviously, some games are too touchscreen heavy and shouldn't really be emulated on something like this, but for the ones that do work, they work pretty good. I've seen better DS emulation, but this is still certainly playable for every game that I tested. Some seem to work a little better than others, but for the most part, you're going to be getting really good performance, and with some games, you can even get away with enhancements. And then there's PSP. So the PSP, I'm going to say it's kind of iffy on here. Of course, with a screen, it's not really suited for playing PSP games, so you can fix that if you want, but I like playing it full screen, no bezels, any of that. So I'm fine with the stretching, I can get used to it. Some PSP games, the lower end stuff, will run fine on here, so if that's what you're interested in, you can go for that. But when it comes to some harder to emulate games, you can play them. At some points, they'll be running good, full speed, everything, but then at certain points, like I think it was in Ridge Racer, yeah, certain points every time you drove by them, the performance would significantly drop, and it makes it not playable at that point at least. So if you want something that's continuously smooth in every game, I wouldn't say this thing is great for PSP, but like I said, if you're interested in a lot of lower end, easy to emulate games, they're probably going to be fine here. And then we have N64. So N64, for whatever reason, did not have any games shipped. Maybe if you got the 128GB model, they would. The 64GB version that I bought came with not one N64 game, but when I opened up the microSD card, it did come with an N64 folder, so I'm not really sure what's up with that, so I brought some of my ROMs over, and I'm going to be honest, I was not very happy with the N64 performance here. Some games like Super Mario 64 were fine at some points, but then did have slowdown at others. But like I said, it's the same, for example, with the PSP. Some points of the games will run fine and be perfectly playable, but then other points are just going to be pretty bad and something I wouldn't really enjoy playing, and other games were thoroughly unplayable. So some games I'm sure will run fine on here with a lower end, easy to emulate stuff. So for now, I wouldn't recommend N64 with this. Like I said, some games could work, but a lot of them just don't seem to be super great. Not like I'm super shocked about this. The Plus is about $70, so I'm not expecting absolutely flawless N64 performance. I was just expecting it to be a bit better than this, but like I said, not super surprising for the price. And I'm excited to see when Garlic OS 2.0 becomes more finalized. Maybe we'll see some improvements, better performance, new features. I'm excited to see that, but for now, most reviewers seem to think sticking with the stock OS is the best option, but for now, we're stuck with Anbernic stock OS. And I'll mention one thing about the controls real quick before I close this up. I'm a really big fan of the new D-pad. A lot of people didn't love the D-pad on the original RG35XX for a few reasons. One, a lot of people complained about accidental diagonals, which is no longer a problem on the Plus's D-pad, and also a lot of people didn't like the fact that the edges of the D-pad seemed to be a little sharp, if that's the correct word to use. Not that you're actually going to be cutting your finger or something, but just that it's not super smooth. They can feel uncomfortable for certain games, and this new D-pad is more rounded, a little more soft. I really love this new D-pad. It feels great, and I have no complaints. It's certainly an improvement. So would I recommend the RG35XX Plus? Yeah, I really would. I find it to be a great handheld, but it's another thing if you already have an original RG35XX. Is it worth it spending around $70 for a new handheld? I would say it depends on what you want, honestly. If you know for sure what you want to play on a handheld cannot run on the 35XX, but it can on the 35XX Plus, I would say go for the upgrade. But I would also keep in mind, once you're getting in the price range of about $70, you should know that if you spend a little bit more money, you can get something that is more powerful and can run a lot more games better than this can, and something that mostly has mastered all PSP games and N64 games, Dreamcast games. DS is pretty good on here. So there's a lot of considerations. And if you're someone that neither has the RG35XX or the Plus, I think it's certainly worth the extra $20 or so to go with a more powerful model, unless you don't want to play PS1 games at 2x resolution, for example, which this can do much better than the original RG35XX. If that's something you like doing, for example, no, you can't do it on the original RG35X and you can't here, sure, then go for it. But if you're just going to be using it to play Game Boy Color games and the occasional SNES game or PS1 game every few months, is it really worth it to you? It depends on how much money you have, I guess, so I can't really speak to you specifically. But for me, if I was really on a tight budget, I wouldn't feel pressured at all into buying the more expensive model if you're not going to take advantage of its new features, because the RG35XX, while not the newest model now, I still think is a really solid handheld with tons of support, and it will for a while just because of how many people have it and love that thing. So I don't think you'd be buying the model that's on the outs if you buy the old RG35XX, especially if you can get a good sale on it, because maybe now you're going to be getting even better deals that it's not the newest one. So there's a lot of things to keep in mind. And once again, if you're going to buy either of these, I'd appreciate it if you use my link down in the description to buy them. It costs you nothing extra and helps support a small channel like mine. So anyway, if you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.